Colleagues, let me welcome you to the National Faculty Meeting. But before we get started, and the real wonderful dialogue that I'm totally expecting, I want to mention something to you to remind you all that the foundation, NLN Foundation for Nursing Education, is raffling off 2 tickets. Now, you understand it's 2, not just 1, 2 tickets to see Diana Ross in concert. This is her farewell concert, and it's tomorrow night at the Wynn Casino, WYNN, okay? For every $10 you donate to the foundation, you'll receive an entry in the raffle. So let me break it down. If you give $10, you get a one-time entry into the raffle. If you give $50, you get a 5 times chance of winning that in the raffle. To donate, either text NLN 2022 to 56512 or scan the QR code, and I hope it's on the screen. I'm not sure it is. Yeah? Okay. We're going to draw a name at the end of this meeting. We're going to, so you don't have a lot of time, right? We're going to draw a name, so you need to be like giving the money now. This morning, so to make sure you donate now. The other thing I want to mention is that the foundation had set a goal of $5,000 being raised before the gala tonight, and I'm acknowledging my dear friend and colleague who I so admire, Dr. Patricia Benner. I'm giving $1,000 on her to honor her, and I ask you to. And I have to mention also that Dr. Janice Brewington, I don't know where she is, she's in red, but she's also giving $1,000 to honor her. And I want to encourage anyone who the Spirit moves you and your credit card works to please join us in honoring our speaker, or you can honor someone else who has made such a change in your life. But let's get this done before the gala tonight. Another $1,500 is not a lot to think about with a group this size and with the heart this size. Thank you so much.
Welcome. And I think you've all had the opportunity to hear the importance of the money that the foundation raises and how it all comes back to each one of us in the form of scholarships and support and initiatives. So I really want to encourage everyone to consider Dr. Malone's message, and thank you. Right now, on behalf of the Board of Governors and the NLN staff, I would like to welcome all of you to the National Faculty Meeting. If you don't know, I am Dr. Kathleen Poindexter, currently the NLN Chair, and I am honored to introduce our meeting. Today, I am joined here on stage by Dr. Patricia Sharpnack, our NLN Chair-elect, who will preside over this meeting, and our amazing, illustrious speaker, Dr. Patricia Benner. I hope that everyone had a good evening last night, and it has been an exciting and invigorating and inspiring summit, especially having all of us together in person. Thank you for being here. Earlier this morning, we heard Dr. Kim Layton's powerful and inspiring presentation, and now we're ready to hear more from an exemplary pioneer in nursing education. It is my pleasure to invite Dr. Patricia Sharpnack, NLN Chair-elect, to the podium.
Good morning, colleagues. This is a privilege to be here today, and I hope you have enjoyed this summit. It's been an incredible experience, and it's still going on. I am so glad to be with you to have this important dialogue about nursing education's bright future. The order of the meeting is that Dr. Poindexter and I will engage in conversation with Dr. Benner. Then we will invite you all to participate in this dialogue by coming to the microphone to ask Dr. Benner questions. Now it is an honor to introduce our dynamic speaker, Dr. Patricia Benner, a thought leader and innovator. Dr. Benner is Dean Scholar at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas School of Nursing, and a Professor Emerita at the University of California School of Nursing. She is a noted nursing educator and author of From Novice to Expert, Excellence and Power in Nursing Practice, which has been translated into 12 languages. She has directed over 50 doctoral dissertations. Dr. Benner pioneered the use of interpretive phenomenology in nursing. She directed the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching National Nursing Education Study titled Educating Nurses, A Call for Radical Transformation, which is the first such study in 40 years. Additionally, she collaborated with the Carnegie Preparation for the Professional Studies of Clergy, Engineering, Law, and Medicine. Dr. Benner has been designated as a living legend of the American Academy of Nursing. She was elected an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Nursing and Danish Society for Nurses. Her work has influenced way beyond nursing in the areas of clinical practice and clinical ethics. She has received 3 honorary doctorates. Dr. Benner is the first author of Expertise in Nursing Practice, Caring, Ethics, and Clinical Judgment in 2010 with Christine Tanner and Catherine Chesla. And she has co-authored 12 other notable books, including a second edition of Clinical Wisdom and Interactions in Acute and Critical Care, a Thinking in Action Approach, with Patricia Huber-Kyriakides and Daphne Standard. She is founder and executive director of EducatingNurses.com and a co-founder of NoviceToExpert.org, an online simulation that teaches clinical reasoning using authentic clinical cases. Dr. Benner has had a memorable and impactful career, and if I said more, she would not have much of an opportunity to speak. So please welcome Dr. Benner. Dr. Poindexter, would you like to get us started?
I will, and I'd say, wow, what a round of applause and a standing ovation to begin with. It is an honor. We have some difficult questions, and it's some trying times in our profession. I think the first question that we would like to ask is how would you say nursing education is doing in terms of responding to the key recommendations of the Carnegie National Study, which you've been known for, a call for radical transformation?
Well, I wish I could say we've just moved a long ways, but I can't. I thought I'll focus my answer because we had 4 shifts that we really wanted to see. In the Carnegie study, we found that we thought clinical instruction would be the most problematic area, classroom instruction. So separated from clinical practice. Lots of categorization and classification. And we easily concluded they're teaching as they've been taught. And of course, we haven't. In the master's program, once we introduced all the advanced practice, we lost education courses, we lost administration courses. So at NLN, I think the last time I was at a summit, I asked how many in the audience had a course in education, and almost no one raised their hand. And so that's an issue. We need to talk more seriously with AACN about the value of education, right? It's a cognate that we need for patient education. It is a cognate for how we teach, and it isn't good enough to just be trained in schools of education. We need discipline-specific training in education. So, but one of the first shifts that we recommended was a shift from this decontextualized, very formalized, knowing that, knowing about, categorization kind and classification kind of lecture. And I love the phrase, subsuming things under categories is not the same thing as thinking. Could you write that down? Subsuming things under categories is not the same thing as thinking. And yet we spend so much classroom time subsuming things under categories and classifying. We recommended integrating classroom and clinical teaching. We recommended unfolding authentic clinical cases in the classroom. The problem is for that novice student in the first year has no experience or clinical imagination to imagine how those formal classification systems fit into practice. They have no imagination for it. So part of the job of the first year teacher, and it is the hardest teaching you'll ever do, because the novice, which is that first year nursing student, not the new graduate, but the first year nursing student, is that they have no background experience to hear and understand what's being taught to them in this formal knowing that and knowing about, with almost no mention of knowing how and when. And the the teacher of novices really has to be able to be like an ethnographer. Well, this is a clinical situation, and begin to induct the student in narrative understanding of practice. That's so important. And yet, much of our introduction into practice is very rationalized, formal problem solving. We use nursing process, which we really shouldn't use beyond the first quarter, because it's the scientific, it's based on the scientific nursing process. It's not really designed for clinical reasoning across time about the particular through changes in the patient or changes in the clinician's understanding of the patient, plus with a view and a stance on the responsibility of the clinical reasoner to seek the best outcomes for the patient, the good of the patient. And we did a study on nurses who didn't go on to become expert, even though they had at least 20 years of experience. And these nurses really didn't ever get that sort of responsibility side of their clinical decision making. And so they thought everything was cause and effect. They thought everything was rational, narrow rational calculation. Now we think that wasn't their fault. We think that's the way we're teaching it. And so clinical reasoning and situated thinking in action and cases, if we could do one thing to revolutionize, I think, both education and practice and even understanding of nursing, it would be to give better accounts of the rapid clinical decision-making that has to occur in clinical situations and the situational awareness that's required for adequate management of acute, rapidly changing clinical situations. We typically only describe nursing knowledge as decontextualized knowing that and knowing about. So integrating clinical and classroom was our first shift. The second shift was to hone in on that integrating classroom and clinical, and we came up with lots of ways of doing that. We introduced the notion of using first-person experience near narratives from practice, and I want to illustrate that before we end today, but because narrative learning from specific exemplars, is how someone learns how to act appropriately in situations. How the notions of good can be instantiated, put into practice. Without narrative examples, you don't really understand that. And we aren't drawing on, for teaching a practice. A practice is a socially organized, socially embedded form of knowledge that exists in the dispositions and the knowledge of the practitioners. That's Alistair McIntyre's definition, and it's a good one. Theory cannot do without practice. Practice is self-sustaining even without theory, because practice is a way of knowing in its own right. How often have you heard people denigrate practice as the mere doing, as if there were no thought, no situated thinking in action, and yet the wellspring of knowledge comes from the practice. And we're not doing a good job of articulating and giving active thinking and action accounts of what nurses actually do in knowledge. I have a great example of a formal textbook account of what a burn nurse needs to know. And then I have a research observation of a burn nurse making these multi-layered decisions about managing pain for a patient who'd is acutely burned, never been diagnosed with sleep apnea, and was over-sedated and having respiratory. I mean, look at all the layers of decision-making. And, the formal textbook account went something like can measure the zones of burn, right? I mean, these are things you do have to know how to do, but it pales in comparison to the actual performance of the role. I'm going to look and remember what the third shift was from an emphasis on, this is going to feel heretical, but hang with me for a minute. A shift from emphasis on critical thinking to an emphasis on clinical reasoning and multiple ways of thinking. That include critical thinking. Now, this isn't so damning as you might first think, because we found out in the Carnegie study that nurse educators think of critical thinking as all good, unbiased, reasonable, rational thinking, and that's not so dangerous. But critical rationality doesn't include the forsake-ofs, the in order to, the notions of good, the agent's responsibility to the patient. It focuses typically on deconstruction, and it's best used in situations where you have complete breakdown. You don't deconstruct Harvey's notion of flow of circulation in the midst of resuscitation. It's not appropriate. So when we use critical thinking, uncritically, we're not doing justice to critical thinking, which is the great tradition of critical rationality, of rethinking situations from the ground up. Clinical reasoning is using your best knowledge of the standards of practice, the notions of good, and the patient's history, and knowing the patient, understanding the patient. And it's not snapshot reasoning at points in time, like the nursing process. It's reasoning across changes in the patient across time. And that reasoning across time is all but left out if you're only using nursing process. So the fourth shift is to move from an emphasis on socialization to and role taking from others to an emphasis on formation, which considers the nurse's own sense of personal change that she has to make in order to be a good nurse. So it's not just role messages, but it's that active changing in oneself to become a good nurse. For example, if you've been brought up in a family where anger was verboten, never expressed, didn't happen, then you have to reevaluate that and have a lot of consciousness raising. If you've been brought up with a lot of implicit and explicit bias, you have to rethink that and reform how you are as a person in relation to others in order to become a good nurse. So these 4 shifts, I don't think we've gotten very far from that. I still think we're much too separated from the actual thinking in practice. I want to give you an example of what I'm calling this first-person experience narrative. If you had your students, and if you email me, I'll send you a little booklet on how to ask for first-person experience narratives and a little instruction on interpreting narratives. But if you think of the difficulty of having the chance to observe your students every learning, if you get written first-person experience, you can also get oral, but it's more powerful, I think, to get maybe both oral and written first-person experience near accounts of experiential learning directly from practice. And treating practice as this wellspring of knowledge development that you engage upon entry into the practice. So I'm going to read you my favorite formation narrative by Minnie Woods, who I got acquainted with at UNLV, but she was a student of Lisa Day's, and she had done this narrative for Lisa's class, and I had loved this narrative for 20 years. So Minnie assured me that she had changed over time. But this is her narrative when she was in nursing school. She said, I was assigned to Mrs. R. She was diagnosed with a small bowel obstruction secondary to pancreatic cancer. During the report, they said that Mrs. R. had been overwhelmed by nausea throughout the previous night and that she needed to have an NG tube placed, but that she was refusing it. My first thought was, thank God she's refusing it, because I knew that it would be my responsibility to insert it. Since I started nursing school, I've been completely terrified of NG tubes and the whole idea of inserting them. I remember looking through our nursing skills book, my first quarter, and thinking that having such a big tube put through your nose, down your stomach, seemed like one of the most terrible things I could possibly imagine. Actually, you really wouldn't want them to think that would be kind of fun, or, you know. Yeah. This is okay. This is a good basis for being formed as a good nurse. It's okay. She says, so it was the most terrible thing I could imagine, never mind actually doing it to another human being. I sat in report that morning hoping that I was off the hook because Mrs. R didn't want an NG tube anyway. As soon as report was over, I checked in with a staff nurse that I was working with that day. I said, so it sounds like Mrs. R is pretty nauseous and miserable, but she's refusing the NG tube. That's right, my nurse said, so you better get in there and convince her that she really needs it. I knew she was right, but I was completely dreading the whole experience. I was already pretty familiar with Mrs. R's history and condition because I did lots of research the night before. When I walked in the room, Mrs. R could barely open her eyes. She was completely overcome with nausea and was hesitant to even move. Her stomach was really distended. Suddenly, here was this woman that I was taking care of who really needed some relief from this tremendous discomfort. I sat down and talked to Mrs. R about the NG tube and why she didn't want it. She was scared, of course, and wondered if it was necessary. I explained how the procedure would work, that I would do it myself with the supervision of the staff nurse, and that once we began to suction out all that fluid that was building up in her stomach, that she would start to feel some relief from the nausea. She agreed to go ahead with the procedure. She could have gone into sales, right? Putting the NG tube in wasn't even that remarkable. It happened just like in the nursing skills book. We connected the NG tube to suction and in the first hour drained 700 milliliters from Mrs. R's stomach. Ooh. About 450 milliliters total after 8 hours. That whole day, and this is the point of the story, that whole day was a real turning point for me. Before that, I was completely focused on myself, my own fears, anxieties, incompetence, and disgust. But when I met Mrs. R and really understood her suffering, the NG tube was transformed from this thing I was terrified of to this thing that could alleviate Mrs. R's misery. A couple of hours later, after a lot of suction, Mrs. R wasn't feeling nauseated anymore. When I went into her room to check on her, she said, "Thank you for convincing me to get this tube put in. I feel much better." That's a singular universal, is it not? You recognize that shift in students, and it helps to have it exemplified. It's not about me, it's about the patient. And that's a fundamental shift in formation. So if I could do anything to convince you of the power of these first-person experience narratives, of all the things you can't be there to observe, and then you spend time really listening and uncovering. In my theory class in master's that I taught with AFAF Melise, it was great fun. I always had the students give first-person experience narrative of something that stood out for them, something that was maybe the quintessential of what they thought nursing was all about, or something where all hell broke loose, or just something that was really memorable. And then I had the little instructions on how to write a first-person narrative, because we're so used to writing in this detached, standing over against objectified accounts. And then I read them all carefully. We had 76 or so, but I read most of them carefully, and I had research assistants helping me. We picked out 6 narratives that we wanted to share with the class, and then we would have those students, with their permission, of course, share the narrative, and the class would think about the narrative. What could I have done to more illustrate knowledge as a way of knowing in its own right, and giving respect for knowledge? One year, I had 11 distinct examples of patient advocacy, giving the silent patient her voice. Following the body's lead in neonatal intensive care and in caring for patients who were unconscious and paying attention to their wakeful and deeper unconscious times. Running defense for patients. See how rich practice can be? We don't have any theory or concepts that can capture the variegations and the variations you will get from the first-person experience narratives. It's important to know how to listen to a narrative and to always ask, well, what did emotional support sound like, look like? What did you actually do? Once at Mass General, I asked this, and then the nurse said, well, it took a lot of emotional support to get the father to stay with the son during chemotherapy. And I said, well, what did that sound like, look like? Oh, it was terrible. The family was pulling apart. The son felt abandoned. The wife said, this is it. He's always flying off to business at the most crucial family moment. It was terrible. So I went to him and confronted him. I said, you have to stay for the next chemotherapy. He said, I can't possibly stay. She said, I'm going to coach you how. And she told him everything that would happen. She met him for breakfast. At the end of the day, she gave him a red badge of courage. And all under, it took a lot of emotional support. So you have to be really, really curious, really attentive, find out what the covering phrases mean, and try to understand that narrative for an instantiation of knowledge embedded in practice that will give you more insights in practice. I have sat and wanted to weep when I've heard in a debriefing session of a student giving this rich, layered, nuanced learning experience about, for example, really seeing the patient as a person. And then the teacher saying something like, because the emphasis in our folk psychology is putting theory into practice, rather than learning from practice as well. Yeah. So I've heard that sort of narrative of nuanced learning, and the teacher saying, let's concept map that, without pausing to understand the narrative. So anyway, I won't go on and on about, but I do think nursing practice is an amazing knowledge-laden practice with rapid clinical decision-making and situational awareness that is unparalleled in any field, and yet we have little account of it. Don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. What a rich conversation
I
that
was
was.
going to say, regardless
Thank
of
you.
the level of our educational level, you've given us a lot to think about and some ideas to take back. Thank you for that. Tremendous.
You know, we focus on generalization, don't we? Where we break things down into element and we say how often those elements occur in a patient population. But Minniewood's singular universal narrative speaks volumes. It's better than any generalization, even though it's quite particular. And this is the other thing you really have to teach your students is how to create a dialogue from the particular to the general. You know, lawyers have to do it, physicians have to do it, social nurses. It's this really understanding the particular in relation to the general. And we're really focused on population statistics, and that's important, and generalization, and that's important. But we also have to teach our students to bridge that gap from the particular clinical situation to the general population. Yeah.
There was a lot in that. Thank you. But you earlier on mentioned clinical reasoning. So my question says that I know you've been thinking about clinical reasoning for a long time, particularly as you endorse the Tanner model of clinical judgment. Do you have any recommendations about how we ought to change the ways we are teaching clinical reasoning currently? And what are your recommendations for teaching clinical reasoning in general?
Well, I think first deeply understanding that clinical reasoning is the perfect analog for practical reasoning. And by that I mean it's situated in practical circumstances. But it also has built into it taking account for better or poorer understanding of the situation. And practical reasoning actually has a solution to rampant relativism, or everything's up for grabs, because, oh, we thought this was pump failure, heart failure, and it was low volume. Once you make that transition, you don't go back. It isn't always up for grabs. In clinical reasoning, you're trying to get a clearer, better clinical grasp of what's going on with this patient. And so it requires paying attention to what went before and what's happening now, and the lab reports and the evidence that you're getting as it comes in. But it also has that huge component. In the burn nurse example I was talking about earlier, this nurse stops at this point she's been talking about pain management and the patient being so obtunded and respiratory sleep apnea. And then she says, and I'm worried about the circulation in the patient's fingers. Not because of the burn, but because of the amount of fluid we've given. So do you hear that? For the sake of, for the good of the patient, for that protective notion of good that we have in practice, well, that's what you teach in clinical reasoning, in addition to the deep background knowledge of the pathophysiology and the patient. You have to know the patient, and you have to know the patient's comorbidities. Yeah. So we really need not to be teaching a snapshot form of reasoning, but reasoning across time through transitions. And I think the more narrative examples you have of this rapid clinical decision-making, clinical reasoning, the better students will develop a clinical imagination for it, and they will see that that's the goal. I've just written a piece, it's in Journal of Nursing Philosophy, on the folk psychology of Cartesianism, which is, it's a philosophy journal, right? But it's Descartes' view of the way, thus Cartesianism, that Descartes' view of the way the mind works, that it's all representational, that you don't understand anything without a schema, an idea, or a concept in the brain in order to perceive. Now, current neurocognitive science disproves that. It is not true, but it's our folk psychology. We think we don't know anything until we can give you a formal concept about it. And yet there's much that we learn. I mean, what we have to rekindle, according to the current thinking on learning science, is how we learn directly from being immersed in the real world and getting feedback from real world. AI folks have the notion, which is strange coming from AI, but the best model of the world is the world itself, the real world. And that's true in clinical practice as well. Once you have multiple examples, clinical examples that you've lived through of a premature infant not tolerating patent ductus arteriosus, the better you are at recognizing it. Same with pulmonary embolus or any clinical syndrome. My heroes in clinical practice are the neonatologists, because they take every premature infant and study it deeply and intensely for learning how to make life out of the uterus better for that little premature infant, and look at how survival at low birth weights have accelerated. It hasn't been from standardized clinical trials, but from direct clinical observation and learning. And we need to enliven that a bit.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
What do you think are the key pedagogical principles or implications for the Dreyfus and Dreyfus model from novice to expert.
Glad you asked that.
Me too.
all of these things that I've been talking about, the novice, that first-year nursing student has to be given principles and guidelines, and okay, if the blood pressure goes much above 150 in acute care, I mean, not chronically, you want it down 130, right? But you give them guidelines, but then you have to explain that ad infinitum, but you don't. You give them guidelines that they can follow to keep them safe and keep them from killing the patient. So it's very explicit kind of instruction. But as long as they're that rule bound, they will be not good practitioners, really. I mean, just marginal performance, not doing harm. So what happens over time, the advanced beginner stage, they still are looking at textbook signs and symptoms, matching clinical examples with textbooks. And at the competence stage, they're totally engrossed in planning and managing and trying to predict and not have unpredictable things. These are all stages, I think, that are necessary. What happens at the proficient stage, and I think we could make this happen sooner, is not sooner as in without experience, but with paying attention to every experience, with clustering the new graduates' experience with all heart patients for a while, all COPD patients for a while, so that they get familiar deeply with particular patients in a particular population, so that they move their perception from the list of textbook signs and symptoms to the real world itself, to actual whole clinical cases. And that's that qualitative leap with proficiency and expertise, is that the nurse is able to change perspective based on whole concrete past experiences. And that's a radical difference. You don't want to teach your students all your rules and guidelines without giving them a caveat. You won't always operate like this. You're learning directly from practice, so you can give more refined, nuanced judgments. So I think much of what I want us to do with narrative pedagogy is to help learners milk the most from their clinical experiential learning.
Thank you.
Dr. Benner, we could just listen to you for hours.
Yes.
I really
promise
mean
you won't
that.
have to.
No, I love this, and I want to thank you for this powerful and so enlightening conversation. You are a leader extraordinaire, all I can say. I know that the audience out there is interested in asking you some questions, so we'd like to invite you to engage with you. The NLN staff, Dr. Sandra Davis, Barbara Patterson, and Susan Fernandez will monitor the microphones. When you come to the microphone, state your question briefly and succinctly, and keep it within a 1-minute time frame. Begin by giving your name and the school you represent. And my apologies up front, because I will probably have to ask you to wrap up in order to provide time for other persons to ask questions. So please feel free to ask Dr. Benner any questions.
And I suspect there'll be many. I know we have quite a few we would like to ask.
Yes.
Hi, KT Waxman, University of California, San Francisco School of Nursing. Thank you, Dr. Benner, for everything that you have done for nursing. I'd love to get your perspective in relation to the definition of direct patient care hours, specifically related to our boards of nursing. In the state of California, we do require a certain number of direct care hours. In my experience, oftentimes students do not touch patients, they observe. Do we count that as direct patient care?
Boy, that is leave it to you, KT. That is a very difficult question. Okay, because I've just lived through everybody's possible history. In the 70s, things radically changed in nursing practice. We went from sort of slow motion practice to instantaneous therapies. Everyone had an IV, and we were expected to correct cardiac arrhythmias. We went through that transition and made the transition with little or no public accounts for it or describing what that meant. It meant death knell for team nursing because you had to have the nurse in contact with the patient to observe and monitor. So first of all, I want to enrich the notion of direct patient care. It's where you're in acute care. It's different in community and other settings, but in acute care, it really requires not just doing of procedures, but really monitoring and engaging in clinical reasoning across time about the patient. And I worry with the new introduction of team nursing again that administrators won't be thinking of the monitoring function and putting that first in the team and making it possible for nurses to evaluate the changes in patients across time. But yeah, so I would say direct patient care has to do with often instantaneous therapies, early warnings. You don't save someone from sepsis without early warning, and failure to rescue. All of those critical life-saving functions, not so much the bed bath or the back rub, right? Not so much the procedures either.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Benner. My name's Liz Lucas, and I'm with Osmosis from Elsevier. And first of all, just what an honor to get to even ask you a question, so thank you so much. But my question for you is, what are you feeling either most hopeful about or most excited for when it comes to the future or current nursing workforce?
The future of?
The future nursing workforce.
The nursing workforce. Oh, isn't that what we're all sitting here? Where's the hope? I think the hope has to lie in a more enlightened knowledge, understanding, and administration of the work of nursing. And I participated in a study on rationing care in ICU run by a group of physicians, and I was really pleasantly surprised to say, oh, no, we could get a whole nurse observation and care of a patient for that cost. And it is that nursing attentiveness and care that saves the patient's life. If we can really increase the managerial arrangement to fit the reality of the practice, that's my hope. That's my hope.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, hi, my name is Eliza Michelle. I'm a new professor with Roseman University, right next door to here in Henderson. I must say I'm a huge fan of you and your work. I did a lot of research in grad school and wrote under your papers. So my question is, our nursing program, we do didactic and simulation first, and then once students complete that portion, they move on to clinical. So what are your recommendations to bridge together the clinical and the classroom with this format that we have?
Get rid of that format. Because you can't, those students don't have the imagination for what you're teaching didactically if they don't have any examples, if they don't have any narratives, if they don't, yeah. So that's why the integration of clinical and classroom has to happen. And remember the quote, subsuming things under categories isn't the same thing as thinking. Yeah.
Dr. Benner, what an incredible conversation. We are all so touched, and I know I speak for everyone, so honored to have had you share your time with us, and are grateful that you continue to change the future of nursing. Please.
Thank you. Thank you.
What an incredible morning. What an incredible time. When you depart from the summit, we challenge you to continue to implement strategies to fuel the fire, to continue to innovate in nursing education, and to continue to embrace the NLN's mission to promote excellence in nursing education, to build a strong and diverse nursing workforce, to advance the health of our nation and the global community. And Dr. Benner, you have given us a lot to think about and to make this happen. And as you leave today, enjoy the sessions, and we so look forward to seeing you later this evening for the NLN Honors Convocation and the NLN's Chairs Gala Reception. So thank you. And wait, do not leave yet. We have our illustrious President and CEO.
Colleagues, I'm the bearer of good news. And of course, my colleague and friend, and it's so powerful to call Patricia Benner your friend. I mean, does it get any better than that? But for Amy Nudell, I just have to tell you, you get to go see Diana Ross on Saturday night.
Oh, she's over there. She's over there.
And Amy,
Left-hand side.
you do not have to go by yourself. There are 2 tickets, and so you have the opportunity to choose someone. And I don't know how you do that unless you hold another lottery or something, but nevertheless, that's not my issue. You have 2 tickets, and congratulations. The other thing I want to say is that my wish has come true. We needed to raise $5,000 before the gala tonight and by the end of this meeting, and we've raised $5,556.
Wow. Thank you. Go forth and multiply. All right.